esteem. Let's start here because this is where so much confusion begins. We throw around words like narcissist, psychopath, and sociopath as if they're interchangeable. We use them in arguments, esteem. We use them on social media. We use them after breakups. And while I completely understand the frustration that drives that language, when we blur these terms together, esteem, we actually blur our own understanding, and that can cost us clarity, safety, and healing. When someone hurts you deeply, your nervous system is trying to make sense of what happened. Esteem. You're asking, was it intentional? Did they know? Do they care? Will they change? Labels can feel like answers. They can feel like control. But if we use the wrong label, esteem, or use one carelessly, we risk misunderstanding the pattern of behavior we're dealing with. A narcissistic personality is not the same as psychopathy, esteem. Psychopathy is not the same as sociopathy. These patterns overlap, yes, but they are not identical twins. They have different motivations, different emotional structures, esteem, different levels of impulsivity, and different risk profiles. And if you don't understand the difference, you may respond in a way that leaves you more vulnerable. For example, esteem. If you assume someone is just narcissistic, meaning driven by ego, validation, and shame, you might try appealing to their image, their reputation, their need to be admired, esteem. And sometimes that works. But if you're actually dealing with someone who has strong psychopathic traits, someone who lacks remorse entirely and sees manipulation as a strategic game, esteem, appealing to their image may not protect you at all. In fact, it may signal that you're still trying to negotiate with someone who isn't negotiating in good faith. On the other hand, esteem, if you label every emotionally immature or selfish person a psychopath, you escalate the situation in your own mind. You may feel constant hypervigilance, esteem, as though you're dealing with a criminal mastermind, when what you're actually facing is someone deeply insecure and emotionally dysregulated, esteem. Mislabeling can either minimize danger or exaggerate it. Both distort your response. There's another layer here too. Language shapes accountability, esteem. When we casually call someone a psychopath because they cheated or lied, we dilute the seriousness of what psychopathy actually represents. And when everything becomes toxic, nothing is, esteem. Precision matters. Not because we need to diagnose people in our lives, that's not your job, but because understanding patterns allows you to choose the right strategy, esteem. This isn't about defending harmful behavior, it's about understanding it accurately, because clarity reduces confusion, and confusion is where manipulation thrives, esteem. When you know what you're dealing with, you stop arguing about definitions and start focusing on patterns. You stop asking, what do we call them, and start asking, esteem, what do I need to stay safe? And that shift from labeling them to protecting you is where your power begins. So now that we've talked about why labels matter, esteem, let's slow this down and really understand what narcissism actually is, because it's one of the most misunderstood personality patterns out there. Narcissism is not confidence, esteem. It's not ambition. It's not taking a good selfie or enjoying praise. At its core, narcissism is built on fragility. When you're dealing with a narcissistic personality, esteem, you're dealing with someone who has an intense need for admiration, validation, and control over how they are perceived. Their self-esteem isn't stable, it's propped up, esteem. And because it's propped up, it requires constant external reinforcement. That's where the grandiosity comes in. That's where the exaggeration, the name-dropping, the subtle one-upping esteem, and the need to be the most special person in the room come from. But underneath that, there's profound insecurity. This is why shame plays such a central role in narcissism, esteem. A narcissistic individual does not process shame the way emotionally healthy people do. For most of us, shame is uncomfortable but tolerable. We reflect, we adjust, we grow. Esteem. For a narcissistic personality, shame feels annihilating. It feels like psychological death. So instead of tolerating it, they deflect it. They project it. They deny it. Esteem. They rewrite reality to avoid it. That's where gaslighting enters the picture. When you point out something hurtful they've done, the response isn't reflection, it's reversal. Esteem. Suddenly you're too sensitive, you're misremembering, you're dramatic. Over time, you begin to doubt your own perception, and that doubt keeps you hooked. Esteem. Another core feature of narcissism is entitlement. There is a belief, sometimes overt, sometimes subtle, that they deserve special treatment, that their needs matter more. Esteem. That rules are flexible when applied to them. This entitlement often shows up in relationships as emotional double standards. They expect loyalty but excuse their own betrayals. Esteem. They demand empathy but rarely offer it. They want understanding without accountability. Now here's where this differs from psychopathy, esteem. A narcissistic person often does care deeply about how they are seen. Their image matters. Their reputation matters. They may feel hurt when rejected. They may rage when criticized. Esteem. There is emotional reactivity there. It may be immature and self-centered, but it exists. That emotional reactivity tells you something important. Their behavior is driven by ego preservation, esteem. They manipulate to maintain admiration. They lash out to defend against shame. They discard when their self-image is threatened. It's not random. It's protective of their ego, esteem. And this is why many people get stuck. Because you can see the woundedness. You can see the insecurity beneath the bluster. You think, esteem. If I just reassure them enough, if I love them enough, if I explain it gently enough. But here's the realities, esteem. You cannot love someone out of a personality structure that depends on not being wrong. Understanding narcissism isn't about excusing it. It's about recognizing the pattern, esteem. It's about realizing that the cycle of idealization, devaluation, and blame shifting is not accidental, it's structural. When you see that clearly, you stop trying to fix their ego, esteem, and you start protecting your own. Now let's move into something that feels similar on the surface but is fundamentally different underneath: psychopathy, esteem. And this is where people often underestimate what they're dealing with, because psychopathy doesn't always look dramatic. It doesn't always look chaotic. In fact, sometimes it looks calm, esteem, charming, controlled. Where narcissism is driven by fragile self-esteem and shame avoidance, psychopathy is marked by emotional detachment at a much deeper level. Esteem, we're talking about a profound lack of empathy, not selective empathy. Not, I'm upset right now, so I can't see your side. We're talking about an absence of emotional resonance, esteem. They can intellectually understand that you're hurt, they just don't feel it. That difference matters. A person with strong psychopathic traits doesn't manipulate to protect a wounded ego, esteem. They manipulate because it works, it's efficient, it gets them what they want. There's a strategic quality to it. They study people, they mirror well, esteem. They can be incredibly charismatic because they understand social cues cognitively, even if they don't experience them emotionally. And this is why so many people say, esteem. But they were so charming at first. Of course they were. Charm is a tool. It's not intimacy, it's not vulnerability, it's a skill set. Another defining feature here is the lack of remorse, esteem. When a narcissistic person is confronted, you may see rage, defensiveness, even tears. With psychopathy, you're more likely to see calculation. They may apologize, esteem, but the apology is instrumental. It's designed to smooth things over, avoid consequences, or maintain access. It's not driven by guilt, esteem. There's also a steadiness to psychopathy that can be chilling. While narcissistic personalities can be emotionally reactive and volatile, esteem. Psychopathic traits often come with a kind of cold consistency. They don't spiral into shame the same way. They don't unravel because of criticism. They assess, they adapt, they continue, esteem. And here's something important: not all individuals with psychopathic traits are criminals. We tend to equate psychopathy with violent crime because that's what makes headlines, esteem. But psychopathic traits can exist in corporate environments, in relationships, in leadership roles. The common denominator isn't chaos, it's callousness, esteem. When you're dealing with someone like this, appealing to empathy doesn't work because empathy isn't driving the system. Appealing to fairness doesn't work because fairness isn't the goal, esteem. The goal is advantage. And this is where people get hurt. They assume that if they explain their pain clearly enough, if they show vulnerability, it will activate compassion, esteem. But with psychopathy, vulnerability can become data. It becomes information to use later. Understanding this isn't about becoming paranoid. It's about becoming realistic, esteem. You're not dealing with someone who is overwhelmed by insecurity. You're dealing with someone who may see relationships as transactions. Once you grasp that, esteem, you stop trying to awaken a conscience, and you start strengthening your boundaries. And when you stop expecting empathy from someone who does not experience it, esteem, you finally stop bargaining with someone who was never negotiating in good faith. Now let's talk about sociopathy, because this is where things can start to look messier, louder, esteem, and more unpredictable. If psychopathy feels cold and calculated, sociopathy often feels hot and reactive. There's volatility here, there's impulsivity, there's a shorter fuse, esteem. Like psychopathy, sociopathy falls under the broader umbrella of antisocial traits. There is disregard for rules. There is a pattern of violating boundaries. There can be deception, esteem, irresponsibility, aggression. But the emotional texture is different. Sociopathy tends to be more erratic. Where the psychopathic presentation might be composed in strategic, esteem, the sociopathic pattern is more explosive. Anger comes quickly, frustration spills over, decisions are made in the heat of the moment without long-term planning, esteem. You might see sudden job losses, broken friendships, legal issues, financial chaos, not necessarily because of a master plan, but because of impulsivity and poor regulation, esteem. And unlike psychopathy, sociopathy can include attachments, but they are unstable. A sociopathic individual might feel bonded to certain people, even protective at times, esteem. But those attachments are inconsistent and self-serving. When their needs are threatened, loyalty can evaporate quickly. Esteem. One of the complexities here is that sociopathic traits are often strongly shaped by environment, trauma, chronic instability, early exposure to violence or neglect. Esteem. These factors can play a significant role. That doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does help explain the reactive quality. Esteem. There's often a nervous system that has been conditioned for threat. This is why interactions with someone who has strong sociopathic traits can feel like walking on eggshells. Esteem. You're not just managing ego like with narcissism. You're not just managing calculation like with psychopathy. You're managing volatility. You're bracing for the next outburst, esteem, the next reckless decision, the next escalation. And here's the hard truth. You cannot stabilize someone else's impulsivity by being calmer, kinder, or more patient. Esteem. You cannot regulate their nervous system for them. In fact, the more you try to absorb their chaos, the more destabilized you become. People often stay because they see flashes of warmth, esteem. They remember moments of connection. They think that's the real them. But in personality structures like this, the inconsistency is the pattern. The volatility is not an exception, esteem. It's a feature. Understanding sociopathy helps you recognize risk. Impulsivity increases unpredictability. Unpredictability increases danger. And danger requires boundaries, not negotiation, esteem. Again, this isn't about diagnosing someone in your life. It's about observing behavior over time. Are there repeated rule violations? Esteem. Is there a consistent pattern of aggression or irresponsibility? Is there little regard for the consequences to others? When you see those patterns clearly, esteem, you stop trying to create stability in a system built on instability. And when you accept that you cannot calm someone who thrives in chaos, esteem, you finally give yourself permission to step out of the storm. Now here's where it gets even more complicated and more important. These categories we're talking about, esteem. They are not neat boxes. They're not three separate rooms with locked doors. They exist on a spectrum, and there is overlap. Esteem. A person can have strong narcissistic traits and also show antisocial behaviors. Someone with psychopathic traits can display grandiosity that looks very narcissistic. Esteem. A sociopathic presentation can include manipulation that feels calculated in certain moments. Human personality doesn't sort itself into clean diagnostic compartments in real life. It blends. Esteem. It shifts. It adapts to context. And this is exactly why getting overly focused on the label can distract you from what actually matters, the pattern. Esteem. When people are trying to understand a harmful relationship, I often hear them say, but which one are they? And I understand the question. It feels like if you can name it precisely, esteem, you can solve it. But the more powerful question is, what is the consistent pattern of behavior and how is it impacting me? Because here's the truth, team. Whether someone's manipulation is driven by fragile ego, cold calculation, or impulsive aggression, the impact on you can still be confusion, self-doubt, anxiety, hypervigilance, and trauma. Esteem. Your nervous system doesn't pause and say, oh, this is narcissism, I'll respond at a level 3. It responds to threat. It responds to instability. It responds to emotional harm. Esteem. Overlap also explains why relationships with these personalities can feel so disorienting. One day you're dealing with grandiosity and defensiveness. Esteem. The next day, you're dealing with chilling indifference. Another day, you're dealing with explosive rage. That inconsistency makes you question your perception. You start thinking, esteem, maybe I'm exaggerating, maybe I'm misreading this, but what you're actually witnessing may be a blend of traits operating together. Esteem. It's also important to recognize that not every person with narcissistic traits is antisocial. Not every selfish or immature person is a psychopath. Personality traits exist on continua. Esteem. But when those traits become rigid, pervasive, and harmful, when there's chronic lack of empathy, repeated boundary violations, and no meaningful accountability, esteem, that's when we move into dangerous territory. So instead of chasing a diagnostic certainty, look for recurring themes. Is there a pattern of manipulation? Is there consistent blame shifting? Esteem. Is there disregard for your emotional or physical safety? Is there remorse? And if so, is it followed by sustained change? Or is it just part of the cycle? Esteem. Patterns tell you more than labels ever will. And here's something empowering. Esteem. You don't need to determine exactly where someone falls on a psychological spectrum in order to decide that their behavior is unacceptable. Esteem. You don't need a formal diagnosis to validate your experience. If the dynamic is eroding your sense of self, that is enough information. Esteem. When you shift from, what are they, to what is happening to me, you move from analysis to awareness. And awareness, not labeling, is what keeps you safe. So after all of this, esteem, the distinctions, the overlap, the spectrum, we arrive at the most important question: what does this mean for you? Because at the end of the day, esteem, this isn't a lecture about diagnosing other people. It's a conversation about your safety, your sanity, and your healing. Whether someone leans narcissistic, psychopathic, or sociopathic esteem, the common denominator is this: if there is a persistent pattern of lack of empathy, manipulation, exploitation, volatility, or disregard for your well-being, esteem, you are not dealing with a healthy relational dynamic, and no amount of insight into their psychology will substitute for boundaries. Boundaries are not punishments, they are protection, esteem. They are clarity in action. If you're dealing with narcissistic traits, boundaries might look like limiting emotional engagement, not over-explaining yourself, esteem, and refusing to participate in circular arguments. You stop trying to win validation from someone whose system is designed to withhold it. If you're dealing with psychopathic traits, esteem, boundaries become even firmer. You reduce access. You document interactions. You think strategically. You stop assuming goodwill. You prioritize safety over sentiment, esteem. You understand that charm is not character. If you're dealing with sociopathic volatility, boundaries may include physical distance, structured communication, and safety planning, esteem. You don't wait for the next explosion to decide you've had enough. You recognize unpredictability as a risk factor. And here's the piece that's often hardest: emotional detachment, esteem. Detachment doesn't mean you don't care. It means you stop tying your self-worth to their behavior. You stop believing that if you just say it the right way, love the right way, esteem, sacrifice the right way, they'll suddenly become someone different. You release the fantasy of who they could be and respond to who they consistently show you they are, esteem. That shift can feel heartbreaking, because it means grieving the relationship you hoped for. It means accepting that insight doesn't equal change, esteem. It means understanding that some personality structures are deeply ingrained and resistant to transformation. But in that grief is freedom. Healing them becomes about you, esteem. Rebuilding your reality testing. Trusting your perception again, calming a nervous system that has been living in fight or flight, seeking trauma-informed support if needed, esteem, reconnecting with people who demonstrate empathy consistently, not occasionally, and perhaps most importantly, you stop obsessing over what to call them, esteem. You don't need to win the debate about whether they're a narcissist, psychopath, or sociopath. You need to ask a far more powerful question: is this relationship safe and sustainable for me, esteem? If the answer is no, the label doesn't change the outcome. Your responsibility is not to decode their personality. Your responsibility is to protect your peace, esteem. And the moment you choose your well-being over their pathology, that's the moment you reclaim your power.